Hello, this is Conway Lynch. I'm presenting my final project for Foundations of Urban Education, and it's called Filling in the Gaps. So here we go. Filling in the gaps, the crucial importance of opportunity-centered teaching in urban schools. Now, what do I mean by gaps? Well, I mean the opportunity gaps. Opportunity gaps are some of the biggest issues in our society today, and especially in our education system. It's important to note that there is a big difference between an opportunity gap and an achievement gap. The term achievement gap doesn't really apply, it's kind of a myth. In fact, it's directly linked to the myth of meritocracy, where the achievement gap proposes that students have differences in their achievements based on hard work and their merit. But the opportunity gap looks closer at things and shows that that's not really what the issue is here. And instead of focusing on merit and hard work, we need to focus on everything that's going on in a student's life holistically. To address the opportunity gap, to fill in the gaps, we need to use Milner's concept of opportunity centered teaching, and especially need to use it in urban schools. So, what exactly is opportunity centered teaching then? Milner defines opportunity centered teaching as a counterforce to multi layered opportunity gaps that exist in classroom, district, and community practices and policies. It's really important to note that we're not just talking about the classroom here, we're talking about the bigger picture. I think that the most important thing is the community. We really, really need to focus on community. And in fact, in my teaching career, I hope to be completely community oriented. Within his book, Start Where You Are, But Don't Stay There, Dr. Milner presents 4 tenets of OCT, all of which I hope to use in my teaching, and I hope that all of you can use in your teaching as well. The first tenet is building authentic relationships. The next is community knowledge. Third, curriculum convergence. And fourth, psychological and emotional health, not only for your students, but for you as a teacher as well. I'm not going to address all the tenets explicitly, but I hope that throughout my presentation, you can get a good sense of where and when these tenets come into play. Moving on, in my next slide here, I'm talking about avoiding what Milner describes as instructional consequences. Now, instructional consequences arise when educators have deficit mindsets about their students, and it leads to them treating them in certain ways or reacting to them in certain ways. The first example, and I think one that's most resonant with folks, is colorblindness. Colorblindness refers to the concept of not acknowledging race or even the matter of race. So, for example, a teacher might worry that if they acknowledge their black student's race, that they might be seen as a racist. This is a deficit mindset because the truth is, race is central to teaching, especially in an urban environment. And these instructional consequences are far reaching. They're not limited to colorblindness. There's context neutral mindsets, the myth of meritocracy, low expectations, and cultural conflicts. But with OCT and an opportunity centered mindset, rather than having a context neutral mindset, you can build on and draw from the community in which you're teaching and use that knowledge in your lessons. Or rather than relying on the myth of meritocracy and thinking that everything's about hard work, you can recognize that students have real problems. They might be working a job at home. They might be coming from a place where they can't really afford food. They might have bigger problems on their mind than getting homework done. And of course, then that leads into low expectations. Many teachers these days think that they have to set the bar lower for their urban students because, well, oh, it'll make it easy for them, no child left behind. That's really, really the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be striving to push these students to their potential. We need to have rigorous education so that students can realize that they're capable of anything they set their mind to, despite what society has led them to believe. And then finally, there's cultural conflicts. And rather than thinking, this student laughs when I'm presenting or laughs when they're in trouble, I can't believe they're laughing at me, we need to realize that, well, maybe they're laughing because it's a coping mechanism for them. Maybe they're coming from an abusive household where laughing is the only way that they can deal with what's going on. Believe me, I identify with that, as I was the kid who was laughing. I was the class clown, and it got me into a lot of trouble, but really I was just trying to get by. Understanding these cultural differences, be they based in race or ethnicity or just where someone lives when they're there, etc., is super important when it comes to discipline. Because if we look in my next slide here, we can see that Black students are subjected to out of school suspension at a rate that's far higher than white students. In fact, the same goes for Hispanic students, Pacific Islanders, American Indian students, and those of mixed race. Ferguson wrote that Black male youth are often perceived by school personnel as embodying characteristics that are maladaptive and thus are subject to redress through removal from regular classroom settings. Black male youth are more frequently disciplined for minor infractions by subjective and or questionable criteria, whereas white males are disciplined for more objective infractions. Black males are often pulled out of class for seemingly no reason. Like I've mentioned before, even a chuckle could do it. This overuse of punishment is damning to these kids because they're literally getting removed from class. It's become impossible for them to learn. They're getting sent home. They can't learn. They're not in school. So we need to combat this by taking that opportunity-centered framework and applying it and thinking, maybe I don't need to call the principal this time. Maybe I don't need to, if you're in a school that has an officer, probably shouldn't call the cops right away. Maybe just give your student an opportunity to calm down if there's something going on. I remember a passage in Milner's book about Mr. Hall when he had an interaction with a Black student who got tired of being told to stay on task, and he got in Mr. Hall's face. And Mr. Hall yelled back in his face, they got into it. But rather than calling the principal, Mr. Hall just let the guy go. He walked out in the hall and he came back and he was chilled out. And then after a week, he said to Mr. Hall, "We're cool now." And Mr. Hall replied, "I didn't think we weren't cool, And that's definitely the way I want to approach discipline in my classroom. I remember being sent to the principal all the time, and it doesn't do anything. Getting removed from class doesn't help your student in any way. What do they learn from that? They're literally being taken out of the classroom. And this doesn't mean that there's no discipline at all. It just means you ought to consider what might be going on in that student's life. They might be dealing with stuff you just truly can't understand, and the only thing that's going to fix that is by letting them relax and you being relaxed as well. Your classroom has to be a safe place for everyone involved, somewhere students want to be, somewhere that they want to learn. And when you have a problem student like that, it's important that you follow up, get to know them better, find out why it is that they might not be paying attention in your class. Again, I'm going to reference the case study with Mr. Hall. That same student he had an issue with, he started to talk to him more, get to know him, how's basketball, that sort of thing in the hallway. And then he played a one-on-one match with the kid. And what do you know? Getting to know him, getting involved with him, showing him that you care, that worked. Suddenly, the student was much more willing to pay attention in class. And that's exactly what I want to do because it's the key tenet of building relationships. So in my next slide, I'm going to show you some of the ways that I hope to build those relationships with my students. To me, building those authentic relationships goes hand in hand with having a good community knowledge. I'm a pre-practice educator, but I do live in Reading, PA, and I imagine that when I'm placed, I'll likely be placed in the Reading School District. So when I go on into my career, I hope to use my community knowledge to engage with my students and get to know them better and build those real long-lasting relationships. That'll be by going to things at Central Park, at the amphitheater. I'm going to teach English, so it would be awesome if we could maybe put on a school play in the amphitheater or even go see some local plays put on by the local theater. Another thing that I'd like to do with my students is take them to the Goggle Works or, just go there on my own and see some of their art up there. Obviously, going to the farmers market is another great thing. Just hanging out in the community, being an active part of the community means a lot to these kids because it shows that you get it and you're with them, you're part of them, and you treat them like they're your family, they're your neighbors. In my classroom, I want to spread love. I want to be close with my kids and show them that I'm there for them, not just as their teacher, but as a mentor, as someone they can look up to, as someone they can rely on, filling in whether they have that void or if they just need somebody else who cares. I want to be that guy. Another way I hope to do that is by showing them my passions. I'll admit it, I'm a gamer. I play maybe too many video games, and another thing I do is play a lot of Magic the Gathering, and I'd love to get my kids involved with that, you know? There are some games that really can be educational, and I think Magic the Gathering is the best example of that. The game requires you to know some math, it requires you to be able to understand fantasy words, and there's a lot of wordplay going on. It's really a great educational tool, so much so that I hope to set up an after school gaming club where I can show these kids Magic and maybe spark a passion in them for it, and, you know, invite them to a community. It's called Magic the Gathering for a reason. There's a big community that gathers around this card game, and it's a really good outlet. In fact, I have some friends in the area, teachers at Reading High, that run a gaming club already, and I've met them because I work at the local game store, and this teacher brings his students in, and I've taught some of them how to play, and it's really been so fun and nice to see these kids grow with the game and build friendships and relationships at the shop and with their teacher, and see that, you know, teachers are people too, and that having a good outlet is a recipe for success. Speaking of outlets outside of school, this brings me to my next slide on curriculum convergence. Miller defines this tenet as aligning your non-traditional forms of curriculum with the formal curriculum. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean your non-traditional forms, you know, like I was saying, teaching the kids how to play Magic, but really it's talking about things outside of school like work, like sports, etc. And we have to be conscious of how those curricula influence our students' needs and how they can perform in the classroom. On the slide here, I have a quote from Oakes et al. That's talking about the racial disparities in wealth and income. And it's important that we note this when we're thinking about curriculum convergence because, like I said, a lot of these students are going to have jobs because they need to support themselves or even support their family at large. So we can't just be dumping homework on kids. That just doesn't line up with their world. It's not, how could they possibly be expected to do homework when they have a literal job to do? We have to focus on effectively educating in the classroom and using what they're learning, be it at work or on the sports field, in the classroom as well, so that we can make that, like I said before, holistic education. Now, the final tenet is psychological and emotional health. And you might be thinking, well, what does that have to do with the classroom? Well, it actually has a lot to do with it because, as Milner wrote in his book, people who are hurting, they tend to hurt others, whether consciously or unconsciously. And that means teachers need to take care of themselves. You can't expect to go into a classroom and have a positive influence on these kids if you're not a positive person, if you're not feeling your best, if you're not doing your best. It's important that you take care of yourself. You have to check in with one another at school, talk with a coworker, a peer, a non-evaluator, ideally, someone who's not going to change anything going on with your curriculum or your lessons based on what you're saying. And honestly, if you need to, rest, retreat. There are substitute teachers out there, and they are looking for jobs. Give them some time in the classroom. And exercise, too. That's important. I'm guilty of not getting enough, but when I do, I gotta say, it does help with my anxieties and stress and anything else that's bogging me down and keeping me from doing my best. I want to end things off today by talking about how we can work to defeat indifference within the classroom. Milner says there are no neutral spaces in the work of transformative teaching. Educators are either working for diversity and opportunity or they're working against it. I agree completely with this. We can't take a back seat. We have to be actively fighting against these issues and working for a better life for our students and for educators themselves. That means that even if it's like an administrator or someone like that that says something out of line or does something out of line, you have to step up and correct them on that behavior because otherwise you're perpetuating the problem. Teachers have to address diversity. They can't dance around it, and they can't dance around the problems that might arise because of it, those cultural conflicts. The number one takeaway here is teachers cannot be colorblind. That's what teachers really need to focus on, because I think that that's something that plagues education today, because a lot of teachers are scared to even talk about race. They're worried that they can't say anything out of fear of being called a racist or saying the wrong thing, etc. Teachers need to just start to speaking about these issues so that they can start to really understand them and work through them with their peers or even with their students. I say in this slide here, you can't just go with the flow. And that inaction widens those opportunity gaps and it deepens what Gloria Ladson Billings refers to as the education debt. I use the Grand Canyon here as a metaphor for just going with the flow and being inactive. Water just flows, but over time, that flow has eroded stone down to what we have here, the Grand Canyon. Think of that as those opportunity gaps, that big gap between the land, that big, deep debt created by the water. That's what happens when you're inactive. You need to be an active participant in OCT. Educators have the power to make real differences in kids' lives, and I know I'm going to do my best and use every asset that I have to integrate all the teachings of OCT into all of my lessons. Thanks for listening, and let's keep working together for a better future for all of our kids, no matter where they live.